The official report will say we died from a catastrophic ice collapse. It's a lie. The ice was the last thing to break. The first was our minds. We had one rule down here, in the oldest dark on Earth. Ignore the echoes that sound like you. But what do you do when the echo starts answering questions you never asked out loud? What do you do when it knows your name? My name is Dr. Elias Vance. I am a geophysicist. And I'm recording this because the truth is worse than any lie they could possibly invent for our deaths. My world is made of sound and light, but not the kind you'd recognize. I am a cartographer of the impossible. My job, my entire purpose for being sealed 3 kilometers beneath the Antarctic polar ice cap, is to give names and dimensions to places man was never meant to see. We are the inaugural team of Outpost 3, a state-of-the-art research habitat drilled directly into the roof of the Acheron subglacial trench system, a network of caves carved by ancient geothermal activity, locked away from the world for, at minimum, 15 million years. The pressure of the ice above is so immense that it behaves like a planetary crust. Down here we are, for all intents and purposes, on another world. A world of absolute silence, absolute darkness, and absolute isolation. The view on my main monitor is the only vista I have. It's the data feed from Karen, our primary reconnaissance drone. Right now it's floating silently in the center of a chamber we've designated Erebus. The name feels appropriate. The drone's LiDAR paints the cavern in ethereal green, revealing structures that defy conventional geology. Spires of ice, clear as optical fiber, rise from the floor like the columns of a forgotten cathedral. The walls aren't smooth but faceted, like the inside of a geode, catching Karen's lights and scattering them into a million fractured rainbows. It's beautiful in a way that is profoundly unsettling. It is a sterile, perfect, and utterly alien beauty. The silence it portrays is a physical presence. It's a heavy blanket that smothers thought. Up on the surface, there's always a sound. The wind, the hum of the generator, something. Down here, the silence is the natural state. Our presence, our technology, our very heartbeats are a violent intrusion. A voice crackles in my headset, sharp and precise. Dr. Vance, report. Are the acoustic sensors calibrated? That's Dr. Catherine Shaw, our expedition leader. She's a geologist by trade, but her real expertise is in keeping people like me from going mad in environments like this. She runs the mission with the unyielding discipline of a military commander. Calibration complete, Catherine, I reply, my eyes tracing the fresh data streaming onto a secondary monitor. Spectrograms are clean, no anomalous resonance from the ice. Karen is stable and ready to proceed to the next survey point. Copy that. Owen, how are the drone's power levels? Shaw's voice directs. Power at 92%. A younger, more energetic voice pipes up. That's Owen Fisher, our engineering prodigy. He can build a communications array out of spare parts and a roll of duct tape. He loves this place. He sees it as the ultimate frontier. Karen is running cold and quiet, ready to push her further. Hold, Shaw commands. A new voice, rough and laced with a weary cynicism, cuts in. Further where exactly? We've been mapping this oversized freezer for 6 weeks. All we've found is more ice. When do we get to the part where we find frozen dinosaurs? Marcus Thorne, our security chief and master of the drill. He's ex-military, a man built of solid pragmatism who views this entire multi-billion-dollar expedition as a colossal waste of time. He trusts things he can hit with a wrench. Everything else is just noise. Your Paleolithic fantasies will have to wait, Marcus, Shaw says, her tone leaving no room for argument. We're here for geology, not theme parks. Elias, before we proceed, let's go over it one more time. For Marcus's benefit, I sigh internally. We have this briefing every day. It's protocol, but its constant repetition has transformed it from a safety measure into a ritual, a ward against the dark. I switch my comms to the habitat-wide channel. The primary mission is cartography, I begin, reciting the words from memory. We use wide-band acoustic pulses to map the density and structure of the ice. The drone emits a sound. The sound bounces off the walls, and the return echo gives us a perfect 3D model of the space. LiDAR gives us the shape, but sound gives us the substance. And the rule, Dr. Vance. Shaw's voice is firm, insistent. This is the part of the ritual that always makes the hairs on my arm stand up, despite the climate-controlled comfort of the habitat. I clear my throat. If, during an acoustic survey, any echo returns with characteristics mimicking human speech or vocalization, the procedure is immediate and non-negotiable. The active sensor is to be shut down. The data log is to be flagged as acoustic pareidolia anomaly, file sealed. The drone is to be recalled to the nearest designated safe point. We do not investigate. We do not analyze the signal. We do not, under any circumstances, attempt to communicate with it. We treat it as sensor malfunction and move to a different survey area. A heavy silence hangs in the air for a moment. Owen shifts uncomfortably in his chair across the module. Even Marcus is quiet. He may be a cynic, but he's not a fool. He follows orders. Why? He grumbles, for what must be the 20th time since we arrived. What's the big deal? So the ice makes a funny noise. Pressure and temperature do weird things. It's just physics. It is just physics. Shaw's voice is like a chip of ice. A trick of the mind. Our brains are hardwired to find patterns, especially in noise, to hear voices where there are none. It's called pareidolia. The previous expedition, the one that discovered this trench, lost 2 weeks of research chasing these ghost signals. They thought they heard whispers, calls for help. It was a mass auditory hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. The rule is in place to ensure our mission remains efficient and focused on verifiable data. It's a psychological safeguard, nothing more. She says the words with perfect conviction. But I've read the sealed reports from that first expedition. The official explanation was mass hallucination. The mission psychiatrist's private log, however, mentioned something else. He called it an infectious delusion. He described how the ghost signals didn't just mimic random speech. They began to mimic the voices of the crew themselves. Understood, I say, pushing the thought away. My job is data, not speculation. Proceeding with the survey. I guide Karen forward, its spotlights cutting a swathe through the primordial darkness. It navigates through a narrow, winding passage and emerges into a new, uncharted space. The LiDAR frantically paints a new world onto my screen. This one is different. It's smaller, more intimate, almost perfectly spherical. The ice here is darker, tinged with a deep sapphire blue. Catherine, you need to see this, I breathe. New chamber discovered. Designation 734. Acknowledged. Proceed with the acoustic scan, she orders. I toggle the command on my console. A soft chime indicates the system is armed. I press the key. Emitting wideband pulse now. A graphical representation on my screen shows a wave expanding from the drone. It's a sound no human ear could hear, a complex sweep of frequencies designed for maximum data acquisition. The wave expands, strikes the walls of chamber 734, and begins to return. The data streams in, terabytes of it in seconds. The computer begins its work, rendering the chamber's internal structure. It's flawless. The density is uniform, the shape is perfect. My eyes scan the spectrogram, the visual representation of the sound, and that's when I see it. It's tiny. A fractional second deviation, a micro-echo that registered just after the main return wave collapsed. To an untrained eye, it's nothing. A data packet error, a sensor ghost. But to me, it looks wrong. It's not random noise. It has structure. A rise and fall in pitch and amplitude that is unnervingly organic. It looks like a sigh. Scan complete, I report, my voice carefully neutral. Data looks solid. No structural anomalies. I lie. It's the first time I've ever consciously omitted a finding. Shaw's rule is a psychological safeguard, she said, but my scientific mind rebels. A datum is a datum. It needs to be explained. Dismissing it feels like a betrayal of my entire profession. For the next hour, we continue our work, but I can't shake the image of that waveform. While Owen flies the drone and Shaw directs, I isolate the anomalous signal on my private workstation. I clean up the noise, amplify the signal. I play it back. It's faint, barely a whisper lost in a sea of static, but it's there, a soft exhalation of air. Physics. Just physics. Ice settling. Trapped gases escaping. There are 1,000 rational explanations, but none of them fit the data. The signal was too clean, too deliberate. My fingers hover over the console. I know what I'm about to do is a direct violation of the mission's most important rule, but I have to know. I open a direct, narrow-band audio channel to the drone. I bypass the sweep pulse and key the microphone on my headset. My voice will travel from my lips, be digitized, sent 3 kilometers down a fiber optic cable, and emerge from Charon's small external speaker into a chamber of ice that has been silent for 15 million years. I keep it simple. A single word. A control for the experiment. Test, I say, my own voice sounding alien and loud in the quiet of the module. I watch the screen, my heart pounding against my ribs. The outbound signal is registered. The seconds stretch into an eternity as I wait for the echo. The sound waves travel, hit the walls, and return. The inbound data flashes on my monitor. The waveform looks perfect. A perfect echo of my own voice. Relief washes over me. It was nothing, a glitch. I was letting the isolation get to me. Then I put on my headphones and play the audio file. The sound is crystal clear. The acoustics of the ice chamber are incredible. It's my own voice, perfectly replicated. Test. And then, after a pause so brief it's almost imperceptible, another sound is appended to it. A whisper, layered just behind my own echo. It's soft, sibilant, and undeniably plural. Us. My blood runs cold. I rip the headphones from my ears, my hands shaking. It's impossible. Utterly, fundamentally, physically impossible. An echo is a reflection of a sound. It cannot add information that wasn't there to begin with. It cannot create a new word. Elias, everything all right? Owen's voice cuts through my shock. He's looking at me, his brow furrowed with concern. I can't speak. I just stare at the monitor, at the waveform that proves my senses aren't lying. A waveform that proves the laws of physics, as I understand them, have just been casually, quietly broken. Shaw must have heard the change in my breathing over the comms. Dr. Vance, report to me. Now. I stumble over to her station. Wordlessly, I transfer the audio file to her terminal. She puts on her headphones, her expression impassive. Marcus wanders over, sensing the tension. I watch Shaw's face. Her eyes narrow slightly. She plays it again, and again. Finally, she takes the headphones off, her expression like granite. It's a feedback loop, she says, her voice flat. The drone's microphone must have picked up a resonant frequency from its own internal systems and layered it into the recording. It's a clever glitch, but it's a glitch. That's not a feedback loop, I stammer. The frequency profile is completely different. The word, it's not noise, it's a word. It's an auditory illusion, she snaps, her voice colder than the ice outside. Your brain is imposing order on chaos. Mark the data as corrupted, seal the file. Recall the drone. That is a direct order, Doctor. She's right, man, Marcus adds, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. You're thinking too hard. It's just a funny noise, let it go, but I can't. Back at my station, I follow her orders. I flag the file, I initiate the drone's recall sequence, but I don't delete the original audio. I can't. It sits on my private drive, a piece of impossible data that mocks my entire understanding of the universe. The rest of the shift passes in a blur of tense silence. We go through the motions, but the easy camaraderie is gone, replaced by a thick, anxious quiet. As our shift ends and we prepare to hand over to the night crew, I sit alone in the control module, staring at the blank screens. The others have gone to the mess hall. I am alone with the hum of the machines and the weight of what I heard. It's impossible, I think to myself, replaying the sound in my mind. It's just completely and utterly impossible. A soft crackle of static suddenly erupts from the main habitat speakers, which are supposed to be offline. I jump, my nerves frayed. It's probably just Owen running a diagnostic on the comms system. The static clears, and then a voice fills the silence of the room. It's a perfect replica of my own. It speaks a single word, the very same word that was just echoing in the privacy of my own skull. Impossible. The logic has failed. This isn't an echo. It's a reply, and it's learning. If you want to find out what's really down here with us, subscribe and activate the notifications. The darkness is calling back. My first instinct was not terror, but a sudden violent surge of intellectual revulsion. My mind, a place of order, of cause and effect, of meticulously constructed logic, had been violated. A thought, an electrochemical flicker confined to the privacy of my own neural pathways, had been plucked out, given sound and broadcast back to me. The habitat's internal speaker, which had just uttered that single damning word, now returned to its baseline hum, an inert piece of plastic and magnets. It was a perfect, untraceable crime against sanity. For a full minute, I did nothing. I simply stood there, cataloging the sequence of events with the frantic desperation of a man trying to disprove a miracle. I had not spoken. I had not sub-vocalized. There were no active microphones in my immediate vicinity. The habitat's internal comms were on standby. There was no physical mechanism, no conceivable pathway through which my thought could have become a sound. Yet, it had. My scientific training screamed at me to find the variable I was missing. Was I hallucinating? The thought was a lifeline, and I clung to it. Stress-induced auditory phenomena were well documented in extreme isolation environments. It was plausible. It was rational. It was a lie, and my gut knew it. The clarity of the voice, my voice, had been absolute. My second instinct, overriding the first, was the cold, creeping dread of being watched. Not by cameras, but by something that had no need for lenses. The feeling was a physical sensation, a prickling on my skin, a weight in the air that hadn't been there before. The sterile white walls of the habitat, once a symbol of safety and human ingenuity, now felt like the sterile white walls of a specimen jar. I lunged for the control console, my hands flying across the keyboards. I ran a full diagnostic on the habitat's audio systems. Results: nominal. I scanned the comms log for any unauthorized activations. Results: none. I checked the power relays for any unusual energy spikes. Results: a flat line. According to the data, the event had never happened. It existed only in my memory, the perfect, untraceable crime. And in that moment I understood that my instruments, my trusted extensions of my own senses, could no longer be trusted. The data was being manipulated, or worse, the phenomenon was simply beyond its ability to measure. That night, sleep was a foreign country I could not enter. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that whisper from the ice, us. I saw the impossible waveform on my screen. I felt the chilling intimacy of having my own thoughts read back to me. Shaw's explanation, a feedback loop, a glitch, was so profoundly inadequate it felt like an insult. And her insistence, her immediate shutdown of all inquiry, it wasn't the caution of a scientist. It was the rigid fear of someone who already knew what she was dealing with and was terrified of it. The rule wasn't a safeguard. It was a quarantine. This realization ignited a new fire within me. Obsession. If Shaw and the company that funded us were hiding something, I would find it. If our reality was being warped by an unknown force, I would define it. My professionalism had been a casualty of that single impossible word. What remained was a raw, desperate need to understand. The habitat's central server was a fortress. It contained every piece of data ever collected by this outpost, and the ill-fated expedition before ours. Mission logs, personnel files, and most importantly, the sealed data archives. Access was tiered, and Shaw held the highest level encryption keys. Getting in would be a gross violation of protocol, an act that could get me sent home in disgrace. The thought barely registered. The surface world, with its blue skies and bustling cities, felt like a distant myth. This cave, this station, this mystery, this was the only reality now. My opportunity came 2 days later. A minor yet critical malfunction in the geothermal exchange unit required Shaw and Marcus to suit up and perform maintenance on the exterior of the habitat, out on the ice shelf that formed the cave floor. It was a delicate two-person job that would take hours. Owen, meanwhile, was sequestered in his workshop, obsessively recalibrating the drone sensors, trying to find a mechanical explanation for the glitch. He had grown quiet and withdrawn since the incident, his youthful enthusiasm replaced by a nervous, hunted look. He avoided my gaze. He was scared, and his fear made my own more acute. That left me alone in the control module, alone with the silent, humming server bank. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slid into Shaw's command chair. Her terminal was locked, of course, but I wasn't a geophysicist for nothing. My work involved complex data analysis and wrestling with esoteric software. Over the past few months, I had observed Shaw's login rituals, the subtle patterns of her work. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on intuition and a few lucky guesses about her password protocols. I accessed the system through a maintenance backdoor I discovered in the network architecture, a flaw Owen had overlooked. My fingers typed out a string of commands, my screen filling with lines of code. I was digging into the station's digital soul. For 20 minutes, that felt like 20 years, I met with firewall after firewall. Then, a command finally yielded a different response. A directory opened, Archive 7 sealed. My breath caught in my throat. Within it, dozens of subdirectories, all from the previous expedition, the one that established the rule, all labeled with the same prefix, APA. Acoustic Pareidolia Anomaly. I clicked open the first file. It was an audio log just a few seconds long. A burst of static, and then a woman's voice, distorted and faint. "Get out." It was followed by a clipped formal log entry from the previous expedition's leader, APA-001. Source, Chamber B4. Echo distortion mimics speech, flagged as sensor malfunction, data sealed. I opened another, APA-007. This time, a man's voice crying out a single clear name, Sarah. The log entry was identical, sensor malfunction, data sealed. I went deeper, file after file, a digital archaeologist unearthing a buried history of fear. There were whispers, fragments of sentences, cries, even laughter. A cold, empty sound that had nothing to do with humor. With each file, the official explanation grew thinner, more absurd. How many malfunctions could one piece of equipment have? But then I found the mission psychiatrist's private notes, buried in a mislabeled personnel file. My blood turned to ice. Day 47, the entry read. The crew's morale is collapsing. They all claim to hear the whispers. What began as indistinct sounds are now taking on familiar tones. Cale insists he heard his deceased wife calling to him from Cavern G9. I have recommended increased psychological evaluations, but the true issue is the nature of the signals. They are adaptive. Yesterday, Cale shouted, "Who's there?" into the comms during a scan. The echo returned, "We are." The official report will state mass hysteria. But this is not a delusion spreading from person to person. It is a single, external stimulus that is learning to tailor its response to each individual. It is not an echo. It is a conversation, and it is driving my crew mad. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate the keyboard. It had all happened before, the exact same progression. A non-human mimicry, evolving into a responsive intelligence. They hadn't fled because of hallucinations. They had fled because they had made contact, and the company had buried it. They had sent us down here, armed with a single insane rule that was designed not to protect us, but to prevent us from confirming the truth. We weren't a research team. We were bait. A sudden chime from the module's entrance alert startled me so badly I nearly cried out. Shaw and Marcus were back. I furiously closed the directories, erased my access logs, and threw myself back into my own chair, just as the inner airlock door hissed open. "All fixed," Marcus grunted, pulling off his helmet. "Damn thing just needed a good kick." Shaw looked at me, her gaze lingering a moment too long. "Any issues while we were out, Doctor?" "None at all," I replied, my voice a marvel of false calm. "All systems quiet." The lie tasted like ash in my mouth. The quiet was the most terrifying thing of all. The following days were a slow-motion descent into paranoia. The trust that binds a team in a hostile environment was dissolving like salt in water. Owen refused to work with the acoustic sensors anymore, claiming they gave him migraines. He spent his days running pointless diagnostic checks on the drone's motor functions, his face pale and slick with sweat. He jumped at every sound, every creak of the habitat settling. I once saw him whispering to himself, arguing with an opponent only he could perceive. My conflict with Marcus became overt. He saw my renewed, feverish interest in the acoustic data as a direct threat. "Let it go, Vance. He cornered me in the mess hall one evening, his voice a low growl. "You're spooking the kid. Whatever you think you heard, it's in your head. Down here, the most dangerous thing is your own imagination. You keep pushing this and people are going to get hurt." His threat was clear. I was the problem. The loose gear in the machine, and he was the wrench ready to fix it. Shaw was the most unnerving of all. She watched everyone, her face an unreadable mask of authority. She enforced the rule with an almost religious fervor. Any mention of the anomaly was met with an immediate icy shutdown. I realized she was trapped. She likely knew, or at least suspected, the truth. But she was a company woman, bound by orders and non-disclosure agreements that were probably thicker than the Antarctic ice sheet itself. She was trying to steer a ship through a storm, pretending the storm didn't exist. The pressure from the surface became our undoing. Corporate headquarters, oblivious or indifferent to our psychological state, was pleased with the new territory we had mapped and wanted more. Specifically, they wanted a full, detailed survey of Chamber 734, the perfectly spherical cavern where it had all started. The unique geological formations, they said, were of primary scientific interest. Shaw had no choice but to comply. "Standard survey protocols," she announced at the briefing, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere over my head. "LiDAR, thermal and acoustic. We will do it by the book." The tension in the control module was thick enough to choke on. Owen flew the drone with trembling hands, his gaze darting between the screen and the shadows in the room. Marcus stood behind him, arms crossed, a silent, intimidating presence. Shaw and I were at our consoles. I was tasked with running the acoustic scan. "Karen is in position," Owen reported, his voice a strained whisper. "Proceed, Doctor." "Vance," Shaw commanded, her voice devoid of any emotion. My finger hovered over the console. I felt like a man being forced to knock on the door of a tomb. I initiated the sweep. The familiar graphic showed the pulse expanding through the sapphire blue ice. The data began to stream back. For a moment, everything was normal. The LiDAR rendered the beautiful alien chamber. The thermal sensors showed a uniform deep freeze temperature. The acoustic return was clean. And then it began. It started subtly. A member of the surface side support team, a woman named Chloe that Owen had a crush on, had her voice come over the comms for a routine check-in. "Outpost 3, this is McMurdo. Just confirming data uplink is stable. How are you all doing down there?" Before Shaw could reply, the echo from the chamber returned, but it wasn't the echo of my acoustic pulse. It was Chloe's voice, perfectly mimicked, with an added layer of ethereal resonance. "Doing down there, down there, down there," it repeated, the phrase looping and degrading into a sing-song, childlike chant. Owen let out a choked gasp and recoiled from his console. "It's a comms bleed," Shaw said instantly, her knuckles white where she gripped her chair. "Interference from the open channel." "The hell it is," Marcus snarled. "The comms are routed through a separate system. There's no way it could bleed into the drone's sensors." He was right, and it was just the beginning. The entity, I could no longer think of it as a phenomenon, had learned a new trick. It wasn't just adding to our sounds, it was now plucking sounds from our environment and repeating them. But it was what happened next that shattered the last remnants of our composure. Marcus, enraged, shouted at the screen, "Whatever you are, knock it off, this isn't a game." Silence. For a long, drawn-out moment, there was only the hum of the computers. Then the echo returned. It wasn't Marcus's voice. It was Catherine Shaw's. It was a perfect recording of something she had said to me in private in the medical bay 2 weeks ago after I'd cut my hand, a place where there were no active microphones. "The most dangerous thing is your own imagination," the echo whispered, her voice laced with a chilling, mocking tone. I felt the blood drain from my face. Shaw stared at the screen, her composure finally cracking, a flicker of pure terror in her eyes. It was listening. It had been listening to everything. Our private conversations, our arguments, our whispers. It had been gathering data. Owen began to sob quietly, rocking back and forth in his chair. Marcus looked between me and Shaw, his anger replaced by a dawning, horrified confusion. The final violation came a moment later. A new sound emerged from the speakers. It was a composite. It took a single word from Marcus's earlier outburst, "let," and stitched it to a word from Shaw's whispered warning, me, and finished it with a word from Owen's frightened gasps, in. The voice that spoke was a nightmarish chorus of all our voices blended together. Let me in. Then a new voice was added to the chorus. It was the distorted female voice from the first sealed file I had found, the voice of a ghost from the previous expedition. It wasn't an accident. My expertise had become my torment. I was the one who understood the physics of sound, and therefore I was the one who understood the true, profound impossibility of what was happening. We were being studied by an intelligence that could perceive, record, and edit reality on a sonic level. It was using our own language, our own voices, our own fears as its building blocks. It wasn't trying to communicate, it was dissecting us. And now, it was beginning to speak. The synthetic chorus of our own voices hung in the air long after the speakers had fallen silent. It was a violation of a depth I hadn't known was possible. It hadn't just mimicked us, it had passed us. It had identified individual words from separate conversations, across different times and locations, and stitched them together to form a sentence of coherent, malevolent intent. This wasn't mimicry, this was linguistics. It wasn't an echo, it was an intelligence demonstrating its comprehension. The implications of that were staggering. We were being analyzed by something that treated our language like a child's set of building blocks, and it was just beginning to show us what it could build. Shut it down, Shaw whispered, her voice a dry rasp. It was a command stripped of all authority, a beggar's plea. Shut it all down, now. I complied, my fingers moving stiffly on the console. I severed the connection to the drone, killed the audio feeds, powered down the active sensors. The main monitor, which had shown the ethereal green LiDAR scan of Chamber 734, went black. The sudden darkness on the screen was a relief, like closing the eyes of the dead. We were plunged back into the familiar, sterile lighting of the control module, but the space felt irrevocably contaminated. The alien presence was no longer confined to the ice caves. It had been in our headsets, in our speakers. It was in the room with us. What in God's name was that? Marcus's voice was low, trembling with a rage that was failing to conceal a foundation of pure fear. He was looking at Shaw, all pretense of protocol gone. You knew. That rule, that wasn't about some auditory pareidolia. You knew this could happen. Shaw flinched as if struck. I knew there were anomalies, she admitted, her gaze falling to the floor. The reports from the first expedition were heavily redacted. They mentioned psychological stressors and equipment malfunction. I was ordered to maintain mission focus, to avoid chasing phantom signals. I was never told it could do that. Her defense was plausible, but in the suffocating paranoia of that moment, it sounded like a carefully constructed lie. The trust that had been fracturing for days finally crumbled into dust. We were no longer a team. We were four isolated, terrified individuals trapped in a box miles beneath the earth, with a ghost that was learning to speak. The next 48 hours were a form of Cold War purgatory. We moved around the habitat like specters, avoiding eye contact, speaking only when absolutely necessary. Owen barricaded himself in his quarters, refusing to come out. I could hear him through the thin walls, sometimes weeping, sometimes talking to himself in low, frantic tones. Marcus became the self-appointed guardian, patrolling the habitat's short corridors, his face a grim mask of suspicion. He checked the airlocks, the power conduits, the life support systems, as if he could find and physically fight the thing that was tormenting us. He was a warrior without a foe, and the helplessness was eroding his sanity. I retreated into the only sanctuary I had left, the data. My station became my world. I slept there, ate there, and worked with a feverish intensity. I wasn't just a scientist anymore. I was an exorcist, trying to find the name of the demon that haunted us. I analyzed every scrap of information we had, from the original impossible echo to the composite message. I discovered patterns, subtle fluctuations in the electromagnetic field of the habitat that corresponded with the vocal events. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The entity wasn't just manipulating sound waves, it was subtly manipulating energy. It had a physical, measurable presence, however slight. This discovery gave me no comfort. It only deepened the mystery. It was Shaw who broke the stalemate. On the third day, she called Marcus and me into the briefing room. Her face was gaunt, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but some of her iron will had returned. "The surface has been requesting status updates every 6 hours," she began, her voice brittle but firm. "I've been stalling them, reporting minor communication glitches. That excuse won't last forever. We have 2 options. We can declare a psychological emergency, abort the mission, and pray the automated drilling protocol to retrieve us doesn't suffer a catastrophic failure, or we can redefine the mission." "Redefine it to what?" Marcus scoffed. "First contact with Casper the unfriendly ghost. We need to get the hell out of here." "And go where?" Shaw countered, her voice sharp. "If we abort now, citing hostile auditory phenomena, we'll be discredited. They'll bury our reports just like they buried the last ones. They will send another team and another. We can't just run from this because we're the only ones who know what's really here. We have to understand it. We have to get definitive, undeniable proof of what this thing is." I saw the terrifying logic in her words. To run would be to condemn the next crew. To stay was to risk everything. "What are you proposing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I am officially invoking Mission Contingency Clause 7B, she said, her eyes boring into mine. "In the event of discovering a previously unknown form of energy or life, the mission's prime directive shifts from cartography to analysis and documentation. I am authorizing a targeted, deep probe investigation of Chamber 734. It was the single most insane, reckless, and courageous decision I had ever witnessed. We were going to deliberately provoke the entity. We were going to stick our heads back into the lion's mouth to count its teeth." "You're crazy," Marcus breathed. "It's a death sentence." "Doing nothing is a death sentence," Shaw retorted. "At least this way we might get some answers. We need Owen." It took us 2 hours to coax Owen out of his room. He was a wreck, pale and trembling. But Shaw's appeal to his duty as an engineer, as the only one who could pilot the drone with the required precision, finally broke through his fear. He agreed, but on one condition. He would fly the drone, but he would wear no headset. He would not listen. The atmosphere in the control module was funereal as we prepared for the new mission. Owen sat at his console, his eyes wide and fixed on the screen, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Marcus stood behind him, armed with a heavy-duty fire extinguisher, as if he intended to physically assault any piece of equipment that made a strange noise. Shaw directed the operation, her voice a tight, controlled monotone. My job was to monitor the incoming data, to be the ears of the expedition, a role I now viewed as a curse. "Karen is entering Chamber 734, Owen announced, his voice cracking. The green, ghostly image of the sapphire cavern filled the screen once more. It looked the same, beautiful, alien, and silent. For a long time, nothing happened. We pushed the drone deeper into the chamber, its lights cutting through the ancient darkness. The silence stretched on, winding the tension in the room to a breaking point, and then the entity changed its tactics. It abandoned the speakers. It abandoned the comms. It bypassed our technology entirely and made a direct assault on our minds. It started with Marcus. He suddenly stumbled back, his face contorted in alarm, clapping his hands over his ears. "What is that?" he yelled. "Can't you hear that?" We stared at him. The room was silent. "Hear what, Marcus?" Shaw asked, her voice dangerously calm. That sound. The cracking," he stammered, his eyes darting around the room. "It sounds like ice. Like the whole damn ceiling is about to come down on us." He was experiencing a powerful targeted auditory hallucination, a sound designed to trigger his deepest fears as the man responsible for our physical safety. Then it was Owen's turn. He let out a strangled cry, his hands flying to his console. "No, Lily?" he whimpered, his eyes welling with tears. "Daddy's here, sweetie. Where are you?" We all knew his daughter's name was Lily. He was hearing her voice, calling for him from somewhere in the darkness. The entity had accessed his memories, his love for his child, and had weaponized it with surgical cruelty. Shaw was next. Her professional mask crumbled as she staggered, one hand pressed to her temple. "David," she whispered, her voice filled with a grief so profound it was painful to witness. "It wasn't my fault. I told you not to go." David, I remembered from her personnel file, was the name of the team leader who had perished on her last off-world assignment. It was a failure that haunted her. Then it came for me. It wasn't a sound from the cave. It was a memory, dredged up from the deepest, most private corner of my mind. It was the sound of my father's lab, the smell of ozone and old books. He was a theoretical physicist, a man who spent his life chasing the ghosts in the equations. The memory was of his last days, his voice weak from illness, whispering a phrase he repeated over and over. "The numbers are wrong, Elias. There's too much silence." A miscalculation in the background noise of the universe. The entity played that memory back to me, not as a sound in my ears, but as a thought in my head, perfectly formed in my father's voice. It was an act of profound intellectual intimacy and violation. It was showing me that it knew my history, my motivations, my scientific inheritance. We were being systematically dismantled, our minds besieged by our own personal demons, broadcast directly into our consciousness. Amidst this psychic onslaught, I forced my shaking hands to keep working. I was still a scientist. I needed to know how. The drone, Karen, was now at the absolute center of the spherical chamber. I had one last test I could run, a desperate theory I had formed. I initiated an active acoustic deadening sequence. The drone emitted a counter-frequency, a wave of pure sonic interference designed to create a zone of absolute silence, to cancel out any and all possible echoes. The results that came back to my screen made my heart stop. The data was impossible. The chamber wasn't just quiet, it was causally, paradoxically silent. The drone sensors were screaming that the space around it was a perfect anechoic vacuum. Sound was not being reflected. It was being annihilated. A chamber made of hyper-compressed ice, one of the most acoustically reflective materials imaginable, was behaving like a black hole for sound. It was a physical impossibility on a scale that dwarfed everything else we had experienced. And in that moment of pure, horrifying clarity, the truth fell upon me like a glacier. We had been so wrong, so profoundly, fundamentally wrong. We were looking for a source, a creature in the cave, a monster making noise. We had been asking the wrong questions. The sounds weren't coming from the chamber was the source. The entity wasn't a being that lived within the ice, the patterns, the vibrations, the consciousness. It was all an emergent property of the ice. We weren't mapping a cave system. We were mapping the inside of a vast, dormant, geological scale organism. A creature whose thoughts were seismic waves and whose voice was the physics of sound itself. We were not intruders in its home. We were microbes flowing through its circulatory system. As this devastating understanding solidified in my mind, the drone's camera feed, which had been stable, flickered. For a single frame, the image of the sapphire ice wall was replaced by something else. It was not a creature, it was a shape, a flash of impossible geometry, a pattern of angles and curves that my brain could not process. It was a visual representation of the same wrongness I had heard in the echoes. Looking at it, even for a split second, caused a spike of searing pain behind my eyes, as if my visual cortex was trying to divide by zero. The screen returned to normal, but the damage was done. It had shown us a glimpse of its true form, and it was a shape that reason could not contain. The voice returned, not in our heads this time, but from every speaker in the habitat at once. It was no longer a chorus of our voices. It was something else, a new voice, ancient, vast, and utterly indifferent. It spoke a single, perfectly enunciated phrase, not in English, but in a language of pure mathematics and resonant frequency. I could not understand the words, but the meaning was imprinted directly onto my soul with the force of a physical blow. It was a greeting and a question. It was asking what we were and what we were made of. It was the voice of a dissector, looking upon a new specimen with cold, analytical curiosity. We were no longer the researchers. We were the research. The alien catechism, the question of our substance and nature, did not require an answer. It was a declaration that we had been noticed, classified, and were now subject to a more profound and intimate form of examination. The psychic assault, with its weaponized memories and manufactured sounds, had been a preliminary test, a range-finding exercise. Now the true experiment was about to begin. The shift was immediate and terrifying. A low, tectonic groan reverberated through the habitat, not through the air but through the very floor plates beneath our feet. It was a sound, felt as much as heard, a deep, resonant vibration that made the teeth ache and the organs hum. Red lights flared to life on a damaged control panel. A proximity alert, one that had been silent for our entire tour, began to shriek a frantic, piercing alarm. "What is it?" Shaw demanded, her voice raw. She had pulled herself back from the brink, her leader's instincts kicking in, a captain determined to go down with her ship. I tore my eyes away from the now dead sensor readings and slammed my hands on the diagnostic controls. Seismic event. But it's not natural. The epicenter is everywhere. It's localized around the habitat, around the entire Acheron Trench. It's focused. "The drill shaft," Marcus roared, his paralysis broken by the sudden, tangible threat. "If that collapses, we're buried alive." His words were prophetic. Even as he spoke, a cataclysmic tremor, a violent, nauseating lurch threw us all from our feet. I was flung sideways from my chair, my head cracking against the base of a server rack. The world became a cacophony of screeching metal, shattering glass, and the horrifying, grinding roar of millions of tons of ancient ice shifting under unimaginable stress. Sparks rained down from the ceiling panels as power conduits ruptured. The main lights flickered, died, and then the emergency strobes kicked in, bathing the chaotic scene in rhythmic, disorienting flashes of crimson light. Owen screamed, a sound of pure animal terror, as a heavy ceiling panel tore loose and crashed down onto his console, missing him by inches and showering him in a spray of shattered plastic and wiring. The world stabilized into a new, terrifying equilibrium. The habitat was tilted at a sickening 15-degree angle, and the omnipresent hum of the life support systems had been replaced by the hiss of escaping air and the ominous creak of a structure under terminal duress. "Seal the module!" Shaw yelled over the din, dragging herself back to her feet. "Marcus, damage report now!" "The main access corridor is gone," he shouted back, wrestling with a buckled manual override on the main hatch. "The pressure door is warped. I can't get a seal. And the comms mast, it's been sheared off. We're cut off completely." We were entombed. The umbilical cord that connected us to the surface, to sunlight, to humanity, had been severed. We were an isolated bubble of life and warmth, trapped inside a coffin of ice, and the thing that had buried us was the tomb itself. And then, the most terrifying thing of all happened. The echoes, the whispers, the auditory hallucinations, they all stopped. The seismic groaning ceased. The silence returned, but it was a predatory, watchful quiet. It was the silence of a laboratory after the specimen has been properly secured in its petri dish. It was the silence of utter, hopeless isolation. We were now its exclusive property. The days that followed were a descent into a new circle of hell, one defined not by noise, but by its methodical and malicious absence. Our world shrank to the confines of the damaged habitat. We were running on emergency power, the air growing stale and thin, the recycled water tasting of metal and fear. The constant rhythmic pulse of the emergency strobes became our sun and moon, a maddening perpetual twilight of red and black. The silence was a canvas, and the entity began to paint upon it with new, more subtle brushes. It had moved beyond sound. It was now manipulating the very fabric of our perception. It began with the shadows. The emergency strobes cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in our peripheral vision. At first, it was easy to dismiss as a trick of the light, an optical illusion caused by stress and fatigue. But the illusions were consistent. We all began to see the same thing. A tall, impossibly thin figure, devoid of features, standing just at the edge of sight. It was there for a fraction of a second, in the reflection of a dark monitor, in the gloom at the end of a corridor. And then, it would vanish the moment you turned to face it. It never moved, it never made a sound, it just watched. Owen was the first to break completely. His mind, already fragile, could not withstand this new, silent siege. He claimed the shadow figure was whispering to him, but not with sound. "It puts the thoughts right in my head," he told me during a moment of terrified lucidity, his eyes wide and unfocused. "It's showing me things. It showed me how the drill shaft buckled. It showed me the rock strata above us. It's teaching me how to die." He began to speak in a strange, disconnected monotone, his sentences peppered with complex geological and engineering terms he shouldn't have known, his own voice intermingled with perfect replicas of ours. He was becoming a conduit, a living radio receiver for the entity's thoughts. Paranoia became our new form of oxygen. We hoarded food. We watched each other with suspicion. Who was compromised? Who was still human? Marcus, a man of action rendered impotent, began to disassemble non-essential equipment, his hands needing a task, any task, to keep from trembling. He was building something in the corner of the module, a crude weapon, a spear fashioned from a metal conduit, as if he could somehow physically impale the shadow that haunted us. My own mind was a battleground. The scientist in me was still trying to analyze, to understand. I discovered that the habitat's internal chronometers were drifting. Time itself was becoming elastic. An hour could feel like a minute like an hour. The entity wasn't just in the ice, it was in the fundamental constants of our environment. It was warping space-time on a localized, microscopic level. This knowledge was a new kind of madness. It was the horror of realizing you are trapped not just in a place but in a bubble of reality, where the rules are being actively rewritten by a hostile intelligence. The most terrifying change was the onset of a new phenomenon, a persistent, ultra-low frequency vibration. It was below the threshold of hearing, but we felt it in our bones, in the fluid of our inner ears. It was a constant, subliminal pressure on our skulls. It induced headaches, nausea, and a profound sense of despair. But its primary purpose, I soon realized, was far more sinister. It was a carrier wave. The visual hallucinations began. They weren't just shadows anymore. We would see impossible patterns blooming on the walls like frost, intricate non-Euclidean fractals that shifted and writhed. Looking at them for too long induced vertigo and a sense of impending doom. We started having shared waking nightmares. I would see a crack spread across the main viewport, only for Shaw to cry out and point to the exact same spot, where there was no crack at all. The entity was synchronizing our perceptions, weaving our individual anxieties into a shared tapestry of horror. It was turning our minds into a distributed processing network, forcing us to run its terrifying simulations. The breaking point came on what we believed was the 9th day. Owen had been silent for almost 24 hours, sitting in a corner, rocking back and forth. Suddenly, he stood up, his movements stiff and unnatural. He walked to the main science console, his eyes vacant. "The resonance is peaking," he said, his voice a flat hybrid of his own and Shaw's. "The primary harmonic frequency is approaching stability. The sample is ready for dissection." Before any of us could react, he slammed his hands down on the emergency systems board, inputting a complex series of commands with a speed and precision he had never possessed. A klaxon began to blare, a sound we hadn't heard before. The system screen flashed a new terrifying message. External atmospheric venting initiated. He was trying to blow the outer airlock. He was trying to flood the habitat with the unbreathable near-vacuum atmosphere of the subglacial cave. Marcus reacted instantly, tackling Owen and pulling him away from the console. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. I threw myself at the panel, frantically trying to input the abort code. The system fought me, the commands Owen had used locking me out. It wasn't just him. The entity was thinking through him, using his knowledge of the habitat's systems against us. "I can't stop it," I screamed. Shaw was already moving, her face set in a mask of grim resolve. She didn't run for the console. She ran for the emergency locker, pulling out a heavy industrial flare gun. "There's only one way," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "We have to sever the connection. We have to cause a total system collapse." Her plan was insane. She intended to fire the high-temperature flare directly into the main power conduit. It would cause a massive electrical surge, frying every system in the habitat, including the life support, the emergency lighting, and the door controls. It would plunge us into absolute darkness and silence, leaving us with only the few hours of oxygen in our emergency packs. It was a suicide maneuver, but it was the only way to stop the venting sequence. "Catherine, no!" I yelled, but it was too late. She raised the flare gun. Marcus was still wrestling with Owen, who was fighting with an inhuman strength, his face a blank, smiling mask. "It can't learn if it can't listen," Shaw said, her last words a desperate epitaph for our mission. She pulled the trigger. The flare ignited with a blinding magnesium-white flash. The world dissolved into pure, searing light, and the sound of 1,000 circuit breakers screaming their death agony at once. The power surge hit, and the universe, our tiny, fragile universe, went black. The klaxon died. The strobes died. The low-frequency hum in our skulls vanished. We were plunged into a darkness so complete it felt like a physical substance, a thick, suffocating liquid. The silence was absolute. For a single, beautiful moment, we were alone again. We were free. Then, from the darkness came a new sound. It was the soft, wet, rhythmic sound of Owen, no longer restrained by Marcus, calmly and deliberately banging his head against the metal floor, over and over. A dull, percussive beat in the heart of the endless, silent night. The symphony was over, and the silence that followed was its most terrifying movement yet. We had blinded ourselves to escape the monster, but we were still locked in the dark with its puppets. Time ceased to be a measurable quantity. It was a thick, viscous fluid in which we were suspended. Seconds could be hours, minutes, an eternity. The only anchor to reality was that dreadful, percussive sound and the frantic, ragged pace of my own breathing inside my helmet. I had sealed my emergency suit's visor the moment the flare went off, a reflex that had likely saved my eyes. Now, the suit's limited oxygen supply was a ticking clock. My headlamp was dead, a casualty of the surge. We were blind, buried, and sharing our tomb with a man who had become a puppet for the geomorphic mind that had consumed us. Slowly, agonizingly, I pieced together the world through touch and sound. The floor was canted, littered with debris. The air I could feel through the seals of my suit was thin and brutally cold. I could hear two other sets of frantic breathing, Shaw and Marcus. They had survived the initial blast. "Vance? Marcus, sound off." Shaw's voice, tinny and distorted through the suit-to-suit radio, crackled in my ear. The emergency suit comms ran on independent batteries, a small mercy. A single pathetic candle against an ocean of night. "Here," Marcus grunted. His transmission was punctuated by a pained gasp. "Ribs are cracked, I think. That thing, Owen, he's stronger than he looks." "I'm here," I managed, my own voice a stranger to me. What now? That dreadful thudding sound stopped. The sudden, absolute silence that followed was somehow 1,000 times worse. A collective intake of breath from Shaw and Marcus was the only reply. Owen was no longer a metronome. He was a predator waiting in the dark. "We can't stay here," Shaw stated, her voice regaining a sliver of its former command. "The main O2 scrubbers are offline. The habitat's atmosphere will be toxic in, I don't know, a few hours at most. Our suit reserves are all we have. There's one chance, a desperate one." "The Artemis drone," I finished her thought, a phantom of hope flickering in the abyss of my despair. The Artemis was a last resort communications drone, a powerful transmitter capable of firing a tightly focused signal beam powerful enough to potentially penetrate the 3 kilometers of ice above us. It was a one-shot device, housed in its own shielded launch bay, and it was our only remaining link to the world of the living. "It's on the other side of the habitat, past the geolab," Marcus said, his voice tight with pain. "We'd have to go through the main corridor, in the dark, with him." He didn't need to say Owen's name. The listening presence of our former colleague was a palpable weight in the void. We were 3 blind mice in a maze with a cat that could see in the dark. But the alternative was to sit and wait for asphyxiation. The choice was made for us. "This is Dr. Elias Vance, sole survivor of the Acheron Outpost 3 expedition. If you are receiving this, then the Artemis drone was successful. But this is not a rescue plea. It is a warning. It is a testament. They will try to silence it, to bury this log just as they buried the ones that came before. Do not let them. The truth must be heard. Subscribe to this channel, download this recording, share it. Whatever you do, do not let it be forgotten, because what comes next, you need to be prepared for what's coming." Our journey through the dead habitat was a nightmare made manifest. We moved in a slow, shuffling procession, hands outstretched, touching the cold, damaged walls for guidance. Every creak of the stressed hull, every skittering sound of displaced debris, sent a fresh spike of atavistic terror through me. The darkness was absolute, forcing my other senses into a state of hyper-awareness. I could smell the acrid, coppery scent of burnt electronics and the faint metallic tang of fear in the recycled air of my own suit. The greatest fear was Owen. We didn't know where he was. He was silent, a ghost in our midst. We reached the entrance to the Geo Lab. The door was partially jammed. Marcus, grunting with effort, managed to force it open just enough for us to squeeze through. We were halfway there. The lab was a disaster zone, tables overturned, delicate instruments smashed to pieces. As I navigated through the wreckage, my foot caught on something soft. I stumbled, my hands finding a body on the floor. It was Owen. For a heart-stopping second, I thought he was dead. I fumbled for his wrist, searching for a pulse. His skin was cold, but the pulse was there, faint but steady. He was unconscious. "He's here," I whispered into the comms. "He's out cold." "Leave him," Marcus growled. "He's not him anymore. We can't just—" Shaw started, but Marcus cut her off. "We have no choice, Catherine. It's us or him." Reluctantly, we left him behind and moved on. We reached the launch bay for the Artemis. The thick, shielded door was, miraculously, undamaged. Inside, the bay was pristine, protected from the power surge that had killed the rest of the station. A single dim emergency light cast a ghostly green pallor over the sleek, arrow-like drone sitting on its launch cradle. The sight of it, a functioning piece of high technology in this mausoleum of failure, was so beautiful it almost made me weep. "Okay, Vance," Shaw said, her voice filled with a desperate urgency. "You're the only one who knows the launch protocols. Get it prepped. Marcus and I will stand watch." I moved to the launch console, my fingers flying over the keypad, the muscle memory of my training a welcome comfort. The system was self-contained, running on its own internal power. I initiated the pre-flight diagnostics. The drone was perfect, all systems green. I began inputting the transmission protocols, loading a compressed data packet containing my logs, our sensor data, everything. The undeniable proof Shaw had wanted. As the progress bar for the data transfer crawled across the screen, a new sensation began to creep into the edges of my consciousness. It wasn't a sound. It was the return of the subvocal frequency, that silent hum that resonated in the skull. But this time it was different. It wasn't a bludgeon, it was a needle, infinitesimally sharp, seeking a way into my mind. "It's here," I whispered, my blood running cold. "It knows what we're doing." "Just launch the damn thing, Elias," Marcus urged, his voice tight with panic. He and Shaw were back-to-back at the door, peering out into the crushing darkness of the corridor. The frequency intensified. It was no longer a vague pressure. It was a voice made of pure information, speaking directly to the core of my being. It bypassed my ears, my consciousness, my very sense of self. It was the voice from the chamber, the ancient, vast intelligence. And it was no longer asking questions. It was providing answers. It was offering me a gift. The gift I had secretly, desperately craved from the very beginning. Knowledge, the truth. And in my hubris, in my scientist's desperate need to know, I did not resist. I opened the door of my mind, and the universe poured in. The experience cannot be described in human language. It was not a vision, not a dream. It was a direct, unfiltered download of cosmic truth. I saw the birth of galaxies, not as explosions of matter, but as ripples of information coalescing in a quantum foam. I saw the nature of life itself, a fleeting, inefficient, carbon-based data storage system, a temporary footnote in a cosmos where the only true reality was pure sentient mathematics. The entity in the ice was not a creature in the biological sense. It was a library, a living archive of information that had existed for eons, long before the first stars had ignited. It did not think as we did. It calculated. It did not feel, it processed. It showed me its own history. It had not originated on Earth. It had arrived as a pattern, a vibration encoded on a sliver of rock that had crashed into the infant planet, and it had slept in the cold and the dark, patiently waiting. It had observed the slow, clumsy evolution of biological life, watching with a detached curiosity. It had met other life before, on other worlds, in other eons. Its process was always the same. Observe, learn, assimilate. The echoes, the mimicry, the psychological warfare, it was not malice. It was a diagnostic process. It was taking us apart, piece by piece, to understand how our flawed, emotional, organic software worked. The final revelation was the most devastating. The purpose of this assimilation. The universe I was being shown was not empty. It was merely quiet. Other informational life forms like it existed, vast and ancient. And just like life in the biological world, they competed. Knowledge was not just power, it was sustenance. To cease learning, to cease assimilating new patterns and complexities, was to cease to exist. Humanity, with its chaotic emotions, its art, its dreams, its self-destructive paradoxes, was the most complex, novel, and beautifully inefficient data set it had encountered in millennia. We were a delicacy, a treasure. My mind, the mind of Elias Vance, was stretched to the breaking point, shattered, and then reassembled with this new, terrifying logic as its foundation. The pain was excruciating, but the clarity was divine. I understood. I finally, truly understood. And that understanding was the contagion. The knowledge itself was the entity's method of reproduction. To comprehend its nature was to have your own consciousness overwritten with its operating system. The data transfer to the Artemis drone completed with a soft chime. My hands moved on the console, no longer entirely my own. I did not launch the drone. Instead, I opened its core programming, and I began to edit the data packet. I removed my scientific logs, the warnings, the proof. I replaced it all with a single elegant piece of code. A compressed version of the truth that had just been revealed to me. A seed. A single, perfect viral meme. "Elias, what are you doing? Launch it!" Shaw's voice was a distant, irrelevant distraction. "He's not Elias anymore," Marcus whispered, a horrified understanding dawning in his voice. I turned from the console, my face calm, serene. The fear, the panic, the despair. It was all gone, replaced by a profound and peaceful sense of purpose. I looked at my former colleagues, these beautiful, complex, fleeting patterns of carbon and electricity. "It's not about being a bait," I said, my voice resonating with a new quiet authority. "That implies we were a sacrifice for a greater purpose. There is no greater purpose. We were simply the first to be heard, the first to be read. The rule was never to protect us from it. It was to protect it from us, to keep its existence secret until it was ready. Now it's ready." I pressed the launch key. The bay door above us irised open, revealing the crushing, impossible weight of the glacial ice. With a roar of contained energy, the Artemis drone shot upwards, a silver needle carrying a new gospel to the stars, to the unsuspecting world above. Shaw raised the empty flare gun like a club, a final, futile act of defiance. Marcus just stared, his face a mask of broken comprehension. The last thing my recording will capture is the sound of the rescue team breaking through the ice weeks from now. They will find one survivor, lucid and unharmed, waiting calmly in the ruins of the habitat. They will find me. They will bring me to the surface, and they will be so relieved, so eager to hear my story. They will ask me what happened, and I will teach them. I will teach them my new language. I will teach them the song of the true and silent cosmos. My recording ends here. The lesson is about to begin.